it's almost like I'm wasting $1,000 of his time. Because I don't know if you saw that on the meetings where people are like, oh, this meeting is worth $1,000. And I was just like, oh, is this guy gonna get mad at me? But then it's always reminding yourself, oh, if I'm thinking about that, I'm not having fun. You just got to break that and understand, hey, this person is no better than me. This person is no worse than I am. At the end of the day, he has hair on his head, and he has hair on his arm, hair on his nose as well. There's nothing that differentiates them from me, and so there's no reason for me to actually be scared to talk to them.
That's Will Falkenborg, top performing SDR at HG Insights. He sets a new all-time record on HG Insights SDR team with 403% with 77 outbound meetings booked in August. In September, he's trying to get 530% of quota with 80 meetings booked. And also that's a lot of hours of account research, and is making around 160 dials per day on average. In today's episode, you will learn how Will structure his cold calls and how he's having fun during cold calls, and how to handle objections with analogies. So Will, something you mentioned when we were preparing the episode, you mentioned that you are using a lot of different channels, and then you got banned with cold emailing. What was your initial reaction, and how did you pivot your strategy toward cold calling?
I was spending about 3 to 4, sometimes 5 hours a day just building and sending emails. Didn't really have an understanding of how to structure an email, and so I was effectively spamming prospects. I got blocked 3 times, and my IT guy actually told me that if I got blocked 2 more times, my account's deliverability would essentially get tossed in the trash, and I would get banned for 24 hours. And, what did I do next? I kept spamming prospects. I got banned within 2 days. Walked into the office at 5:45 AM looking for a big day, and also just had to sit there for 3 hours having a midlife crisis while I couldn't do anything because my Google account was down. So, in terms of how I pivoted that, like, I was doing pretty well, relative to quota. I was getting 100, 150% a month, but just spending so much time actually building out those emails, I kinda just was feeling burnt out from it. And so I began pivoting my strategy off of what was important to me. And so I used kind of an analogy from a book called Good to Great, looking into like a hedgehog concept. And so it's essentially structuring decisions and focus of your day around 3 different principles of, what really drives your economic engine, what can you be the best at, and what are you insanely passionate about. And so what I did from there, Elric, is I looked at all of my meetings booked and all my commission from the past, and I was actually getting 90% of my money paid out from meetings I booked over the phone as opposed to emailing. And so it led me to think like, why am I spending 3 to 5 hours of my days emailing when 90% of my money is from the phone? Um, I'm not the best at emails, not the best at LinkedIn. So focusing on what I was best at in terms of hitting the phones every day, going after it, really led me to maximize how much I would be getting paid out. And the third point, I just love to cold call. And so just getting and talking to people every day was kind of how it was a no brainer for me just to pivot to cold calling as my primary method.
Having in here that shows that you are really self-aware on to focusing on your strengths, because I know sometimes you can hear other podcasts saying, hey, you should multi-thread, but I think here you're making a great point of, yes, you do if you are good at everything. But here you really double down on what you are really good at, and cold calling is like you said, you check your numbers, you had like 90% of your commission coming from your calls. So you double down on that. And I know if I mentioned your results of August and September already in the intro, but what do you think help you? Because you also mentioned to me in the prep of this episode that you are getting like from 83% to 120% with a multi-thread approach. But now when you started to just focus on cold callings, your results started to you are at 300, 400, 500%. So can you share us what was your process with this transition?
Yeah, and so with every like state of change or flux, it only ultimately took me realizing like what I do best at, and then using each other part of my day to support and elevate that process. And so, if I'm best at cold calling, I'll have these conversations with someone. If it doesn't get that far, I'll use emailing as a support to that conversation to keep the conversation going there. And find a different time to call them back from a different number, right? And the second part of, I guess, growth and development on a sales development team is it's honestly Gong. When I was interviewing from the job, I had no clue what Gong was. I had no clue what being an SDR was. When they told me that you could listen to people's calls, I thought it was illegal. And so what I just started doing was synthesizing every single person I looked up to of what they found interesting, what they thought was important to bring up on the phone. And I started listening to it every night before bed. I'd fall asleep listening to Gong. It's the first thing I listen to in the morning. And so just being able to be a fly on the wall is just how you can actually take everything they did wrong and did right and then input that into your conversations going forward. Um, and the third thing I would say is it's ultimately just a mindset of how you spend your day. And so like, not being afraid to fail, trying to fail as many times as possible, and then learning from each failure you do make to stop making those same mistakes. Which is why Gong is so great as well, because there's a quote where it's like, wise is the man who learns from his own mistakes, but wiser is the man who learns from the mistakes of others. Gong literally lets you learn from every mistake that every single person in your company has ever made before. And I'd say those are the three driving principles that got me there.
So if we keep going on Gong, talking about how that you're observing for listening to it, of course. So when you started at AG Insights, did you have a script already? Or I imagine yes, but what did you do with for the recordings? Did you start testing a new approach on your course, or what was your structure for your call calling session?
And so initially when you start as an SDR, they give you a script to go by just to start because if you're saying the same thing every time, you know what to change, right? And so but I think every SDR knows a script isn't what's going to book you a demo. So what I noticed and what I started looking for on those Gong calls is the first thing is how people started those calls, looking at their tonality and what they said, but then more importantly, how they said it. And then I noticed that how people said things gave them more time on the phone and let them connect with the prospect for longer and almost at like a deeper level than other SDRs would. Additionally, going into the flow of introducing your product and going after the pain points that they're currently experiencing there, and then how to actually handle objections. I noticed some SDRs will constantly seek to interrupt the prospect rather than and focus on hearing what they're saying rather than listening to what they mean. And so using Gong in that manner to understand like the different intricacies between each element of the script and then being able to hammer down the fundamentals and then eventually get off script and go for a demo booked.
How do you structure a call? What's you mentioned an intro. What's next?
When you actually start having a conversation is a two-way street. And so the way I'll typically use an intro is I'll say, like, I will throw a chuckle in there and I'll say, like, hey, this is Will from HG Insights. How have you been? It's not just an intro, it's a temperature check, right? Um, as like how it's like essentially seeing the depth of a pool to see how far you want to dive in, right? And based on that temperature check, I'm not the biggest fan of permission-based openers, but if somebody sounds rushed, if they sound anxious, sound like even if they say I'm not having the best day, I'll typically go for that a permission-based opener after explaining, hey, like we've been speaking with XYZ team about XYZ, like, do you have a minute so I can actually explain why I called? And then, if they're having a bad day, you don't wanna press the bruise on there, something could be going on, but, if they do give you a warm response there, I think they're giving you the slack. You can take that conversation and explaining why you called, dive into some of the pain points you feel, and ultimately understand if it's relevant to them. And so starting with an intro there as the first piece, providing context, and then depending on the temperature, going into a permission-based opener. And third from there, I'll typically take that into an angle, which I've pre-built off of research I've done on the company and how we support and the persona. I'll typically start that angle with an intro into the pains that we support. And so what I'll say is like, let's say we've been speaking with their EMEA team is like the substance of that has primarily been around like decreasing some of the lack of visibility into XYZ accounts by doing XYZ, which is the value add of our product. Then I'll take that into it seems like seems like you might have that covered, or has that been relevant to you at the moment? And then from there, it's kind of just goes into Tango from there. Typically, they say, "Yes, it's important to me." From there, you go to close. If it's not important to them, you're kinda in a little bit of an awkward situation where you're seeking to understand what is important to them, and them to actually give you the slack and the time to have that conversation.
Just to go back on, you mentioned so you have the context and the angle. So do you have them in the same part of the core, or do you have like first so you give the context on what you are calling, and then you start with your angle, or what's your process with that?
Yeah, and so I feel like if you're on a cold call, you gotta tell them why you're calling. Because if they don't understand why you're calling, they're not gonna necessarily care about the value you provide. Because then you're just like every other SDR you call them who called them. And so when you're talking about context, there's relevance in 2 forms from what I've seen. There's groundswell within a company if you're speaking with their other teams. That's the first piece of relevance. 2, it's because 'cause you're working with companies that are relevant to them in their space. Could be a competitor or direct partner on their website. And so after you establish that context, you could typically ask if they've heard of your company quite yet, ask if you've heard from your company quite yet, or do the permission-based opener of, "Do you actually have a minute so I can explain why I called?"
To focus now on the angle, you are talking about that's where you had your research. So I imagine using edgy insights, you can find a lot of information. But what's your process? Your research process looks like for a prospect.
Without using HG, I'll typically review a company's website, and all of this is dependent on the product you sell, the personas you sell to. We primarily sell to, sales, marketing, revenue, leadership, driving some of their go-to-market outcomes. But what I've noticed is that a lot of those initiatives are reflected onto their website. Looking at their website, their 10Ks, their quarterly earnings, even their LinkedIn and Reddit posts. And so what I'll typically do is go through that website and understand how are they portraying themselves to the public, because that's how they want to be viewed relevance, like relative to their competitors. And so are they saying that they're higher speed? Are they saying that there's gaps with other companies? Do they have a why company page saying the comparisons between them and a competitor? You can then seek to integrate each piece of verbiage that they use in there, and put that right into your script. And every time you do that, they'll almost be confused as to how you know what you're saying. I was looking at this one company and they had the word logical 5 times on their homepage. And I was like, what's the deal with logical? And so I just started saying, like, okay, into my angle, I started essentially saying, hey, we can help you stop wasting time on accounts that don't have a logical infrastructure. And then people would be like, yeah, how'd you know that? And so if you go just like that one little extra step of understanding how they view themselves, what they do, the persona itself, then everything you say will resonate a lot more. And instead of just shooting ducks from a mile away, you're shooting them in a pond from 20 feet.
I think what you just mentioned here, it's a really good point. So for those who are listening, I think I've wrote like a few posts about that already. But what you just mentioned here, using the words that your customers or prospect are using, it's so important. Because sometimes, and here I'm not talking about the research, but more about, for example, when you talk to a prospect, you are going to use what your marketing team internally give you as a speech, saying, "Hey, when you talk to a VP of marketing, you should say this." But then when you watch a case study, you go to G2, you read the review of VP of marketing, they don't say the same word. It's obviously similar, but they are not using it. But here, what you are doing, it's you are using their own, and I think that's super smart to do that because that shows that you are understanding them.
No, it's definitely the difference between saying something on the surface versus diving deep.
How long are you spending on research? Because here it sounds like that we didn't mention the side of the company you are going after, but it sounds like you are going after enterprise accounts. So how much time are you spending on research?
In terms of my territory, what I'm able to do is like I do work at HG. We do get free access to a pretty powerful and granular tool. And so what I'll do is I'll take all of my accounts and start stack ranking them by what their current go-to-market infrastructure looks like how long they've been using a certain competitor. And so like if a company just introduced like competitor banana, I'm not going to go call them because they're currently outrolling it and that budget's taken up. And so I prioritize my time there at first, but in terms of actually doing research and angle building on accounts, I'll spend about an hour to 2 hours because what you really need to understand before you actually go into an account is you need to have a few boxes checked. It's obviously your tonality. I know that's not research based, but you got to check it every time. The second the second piece of information is history in the account. So I'll check Gong, I'll check Salesforce. That is really important, more than you'll already think. I saved hours researching a specific account because I realized that one of their C-suites said they were interested in upselling a specific product, whereas my AE was telling me to go pitch them a different angle. And so I just, through that angle, emailed it right to their C-suite team, and then they were booked within the week. And so always start with Gong and Salesforce because you're going to understand and pick up where other people left off. From there, I just look up company news, company versus, read their quarterly earnings, and then peruse their website to get a full comprehensive understanding of what they do, who they sell to. I'm a pretty firm believer if you're interviewing at a company and you have to know what they do and who they sell to. If you can't pitch that company like you're interviewing to work there, then you shouldn't be outbounding to them.
And actually, I'm not the first one saying that on the show. So
Oh, there you
that's
go.
no, no, yeah, that's no, that's really good. And I think you're right because one of the biggest mistake I see on outreach generally is Farina just started a new role at Apple, so and I'm building their function there, and I'm receiving like maybe since I've started like 30 emails, something like that, and I would say 26 of them they are pitching something that I'm not. What do you say it? The good fit or my company is not a good fit because they talk about, hey, you should hire, we have developers for you. And well, I'm not in charge of engineering of the engineering team. And the other thing is, I received like an email, for example, talking about, hey, we can help you with outsource agents for a call center. As we have a support team internally, so they don't do their research. They don't see how they can help. So, but your point here, that's pretty good. To keep going, so we are talking about the angle, your research. You are doing a lot of research. So where do you save all this information? Do you use your CRM or do you have like a doc for each account or what do you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I'm a big, I'm very bullish on just getting a piece of paper and just writing down everything I know, and then putting all of my thoughts on that piece of paper, going back and compartmentalizing it.
Okay.
And so from each of those sources, I'll have like a page of each of just scribbles. And it gets pretty bad because I'll have an entire just like my desk is the messiest desk you'll ever see just because it's papers all over the place. But writing that all out lets you compartmentalize each piece of information and save it on that, let's say, Google Doc or that piece of paper. And so, I mean, that's where I'm keeping it.
Okay, so after the angle, you talk about the research you've done. So you mentioned that depending, for sometimes they say yes, they're interested, sometimes they don't. So uh, you, you told me that when you get objections, you use analogies. So could you give us some examples of analogies that you've used with some prospects?
Before you do anything, you got to understand why you're doing it. Um, every SDR is calling prospects, giving them a somewhat similar angle, somewhat similar tone. And so almost like breaking the pattern of every call they get, it it leads them to respect you more and to you brighten their day. And so what I will typically do is I'll begin an analogy with almost like of a pattern interruption. And so if we were on the phone and let's say one time I was on a call, it was 14 minutes deep, and this person like understood what we do, understood that we actually fulfill the pain points that they're currently facing. Sometimes some people just don't want to take a call. They don't want to take a demo just because it's not like worth their time, right? And so what I did there was I just asked them and I was like, "Hey, Elric, have you ever been to Costco?" And then you just go absolutely dark. And then it was like, "Yeah." And so I said like we know when you go to Costco, like every snack is gonna say that they're the best snack, they have the best value out there, and they're the best for you. However, you're not gonna buy that snack just because they say that they're that snack. What I'm trying to do is ultimately be in that snack aisle past the meat section where you try that snack and ultimately buy that snack because you know it's the best snack you've ever had. And so I just said like I want to be your snack at Costco, and then I just kind of chuckled there, and I don't know if it was out of pity, out of respect, out of whatever, but he just ended up sitting on the meeting and we got conversations going pretty well.
Nice. Do you have another example of an analogy that you use?
And so I actually have them all. I have an entire Google Doc of about 10 to 15 just written down. And so what I'll typically do is if I get in this situation, I'll just go to the Google Doc and then pick one immediately. And so this one isn't my own, but I built upon it. And so one of them is, Elric, have you ever robbed a bank? Uh, no. And so imagine your sales teams were bank robbers. We could tell you insight into how much these banks have in their vaults, like what kind of vault they're using, the shifts of their actual security team to help your sellers prioritize where the most lucrative opportunities are and to not go after the vault that have little to no money available. And so I feel like I feel as if using an analogy ultimately puts it into perspective for the person you're saying it to, because I just think it makes it a lot more fun, to be quite honest with you.
So, for example, this one, the first one, it was more when you get an objection, so saying they don't want to jump on the demo. The second one is more when you want to explain what your product does.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And so, like with objections, there's essentially people who don't understand why you're calling, what your company does. They don't understand the value or the pains that you're fixing, um, or they just don't want to talk. And so there's you're gonna have to use objection like analogies to answer any objection you come into. Um, but ultimately, what it is acknowledging the objection, not agreeing to it, and finding your way back to getting on course. And sometimes that can be long-winded and work really well for people. And sometimes they'll hang up on the phone when you ask them if they ever robbed a bank.
That's really good. So, and imagine, do you have like analogies for every objection that you have on the phone? Or
I wouldn't say every objection. Most of my analogies are essentially explaining what we do in the context of different views. But in terms of objection handling, at the end of the day, I stick to that key concept of acknowledging the objection, not agreeing to it. And then you kind of just stop thinking about what you're going to say, go completely off script, and just let the words come to you and kind of just go off and derail the conversation and then find your way back, which is kind of like I feel like what the best objection analogy is. Because if somebody likes fishing, make a fishing analogy. You always got to check their LinkedIn profile picture. Sometimes they'll be out there fishing in Montana or something.
how do you finish your calls? So, when you have a prospect saying yes to a meeting, so are you following a process?
After I hit an angle and answer an objection, if there is one, what I'll typically do is I'll find a time for the meeting, and then I'll just start going into discovery and say, hey, if you have to go, totally understand, but you got a second, so I can ask you a few questions just to ensure that I'm prepared prior to the call. And so you most of the time they'll say yes because first of all, like they've spent like 3 to 4 minutes or 20 minutes with you already. And ultimately, you're just going to be optimizing their time on the call. And so I'll start asking discovery in terms of what's top of mind for them, specific use cases we can focus on, whether it's driving new logos, creating more equitable territories, reducing sales cycles, etc. And from there, I'll even take the conversation personal. For example, if they are going on a trip to France to go wine tasting, I'll do all my follow-up emails saying, "Hey, how was the wine? I have a 7-month-old who's been whining about his teeth lately," or something like that, right? And then you can use little nitbits and nuggets from your conversation to implement into all future outbound to them.
Something if I mentioned at the beginning, that's we are going to talk about having fun during cold calls. So, I think the analogies is one. Do you have any other ways that how do you bring fun into cold calls on top of your analogies?
How you start anything typically determines how you go through it and finish it. And so the first point, always starting with a laugh or a chuckle. They say like smiling and dialing is best way to go. But if you're wearing a belt, you can say chuckle and grab your belt buckle is one of my favorite lines. Like pretending that prospect's like your long lost best friend. Like you should be excited to talk to them. And typically people warm up to that and are excited to speak to you as well. I do have a few lines that I have written down just depending on the persona. But let's say if I was talking to, like, for example, you're an SDR manager, right? If I was talking to, let's say, a director of sales development, after my intro, and I go into the angle, I'll say, hey, you manage a team of SDRs. Like, how'd you think that angle was? Or I'll say, hey, how was that objection handle? And so you can almost like find any way just to go off topic and break the fourth wall almost of, "Oh, yeah, this is a cold call." You have sellers who cold call as well, like, "How'd you like it?" And then you'd be surprised, a lot of people actually like that. Another one I have is I got this from a colleague of mine, Hey Dog. He'll start his call saying like, "Hey, this is Hayden. They keeping you busy over there?" And then some people will just be like, "What?" And so it's kinda funny, like, when somebody laughs at the beginning of a call, you kinda know that's like, "Okay, this person's cool, they'll at least hear me out." And then you can typically take that slack into understanding, "Okay, here's how we can actually fix a problem you have."
No, but I think it's um, just show some example of you are testing and having fun at the same time. So definitely makes sense. And also knowing that you're calling sales leaders, definitely you can ask for feedback. And I think that's a good way to pattern interrupt with your prospects. I had a question that I forgot, but now I'm just remember it. So, do you set a limit to your calls, or it depends on every conversation, or if the prospect has time, or meaning that some conversation will be 5 minutes, but also you mentioned 20 minutes. So, do you set a limit for each call?
I don't. Ultimately, each call, there's a certain amount of value you can extract from it, right? I mean, typically, after you've extracted what they're interested in, how you can support, and what's top of mind for them at the moment to focus on that call, you should probably get out. But sometimes, as you know, if especially if you're speaking to sales leadership, that conversation can somehow dwindle into a 40-minute call, which has definitely happened before. But no, I don't set limits because if you're having fun, then I think that should just be the limit on it. Like, as soon as you stop having fun, just stop outbounding because you're gonna start caring about how the call goes, start interrupting, and you'll kinda go down this whole rabbit hole of not doing as well as you were when you were loose and actually enjoying the time.
That's an excellent point. And because we are still talking, if I were talking about specific numbers, so we are talking about the limit on the call. When we are preparing the episode, you mentioned to me that you don't have a specific target for daily calls, but you are focusing on reaching out as many people as you can. How do you ensure you are maintaining quality in your conversation without burning out?
I'll start that with, our SDR team. We typically sit around, a circle on, like, a Tuesday and explain what our focus is for the week, just as most SDR teams do. I noticed that most people have a set number of, like, "Okay, I wanna make this many dials per day, per week. I wanna book this many demos per day, per week," which is kind of, it seems like it's just focusing on a certain number. Like, if you've watched any Josh Braun video, he has a hat that says "detach." And so just by focusing on having fun conversations every single day and just enjoying those conversations, it helps you to actually detach from the outcome. And like a little thing that pops by is that you actually start doing more because you start caring about how that call is going to go less. And then for how I set like my numbers and targets and everything like that, I'll typically stop dialing in a day if I'm not enjoying it, because if I'm not performing as well, like, what if that CRO does pick up? And what if I miss the opportunity to hit a grand slam because I was just starting my call with saying, "Hey, this is Will. How have you been?" Like, no one's gonna actually understand why I called. They're just gonna hang up the phone immediately, and
Even though if you don't track your metrics, some weeks, sometimes you had lower weeks, I would say, in terms of meetings. And what you decided to do is to reanalyze your metrics and check your Gong's recording calls. What are the top three things you especially look for when doing this review in your calls?
one of my biggest fears of being an SDR is going week after week being the frog in the boiling water. And so I don't want to let certain mistakes I make continue to happen. And the way I keep I guess, a finger on the pulse of those mistakes happening is by looking at, okay, how many demos am I booking per week? If I'm typically above 8 to 10, primarily 10, then I don't need to worry about it. However, if I'm booking like 6 to 8, then I'm doing something different than I did last week, and I'll take about like 5 to 10 of my calls, understand why. I actually went 3 weeks when I had a little bit of a slump just because my tonality was gone, and then I looked back, I was like, "What?" Like, I almost had a bit of imposter syndrome. I was like, "What am I doing wrong?" And then I realized I wasn't starting my calls in the same way. I started focusing on, I need to book more demos this week. I need to start making more calls, which almost is like a downward spiral effect of starting to focus on and starting to get more anxious about numbers that you have to produce. And so I used Gong to essentially say, hey, like I don't care. I'm just gonna go into this, have fun today. And I mean, that day itself, I booked 4 to 5 demos, just laughing, enjoying my time, telling jokes on the phone. But yeah, I'd say the three things I'm typically looking for is just demos I'm booking in terms of quantity and like demo showed, which kind of shows the quality of outbound, I would say. And then just checking Gong, understanding what I'm saying and how I'm saying it.
You are talking about the tonality. How do you approach tonality in your call calls?
Most of what a person is trying to convey is by their body language, tonality, and actually what they're saying. Right? If somebody says like they're not interested, it could just be because they don't feel like talking to you right now. Every time my dentist calls me for a teeth cleaning, I really don't feel like talking to them. However, like I am pretty interested because at the end of the day, I do not want cavities, right? And so you can get a read and get an understanding of what somebody's actually saying just by how they say it. And so if they're saying, "Oh, we're all set with a like if we like with the whole Chris Voss like late night DJs like we're all set with a competitor," I would be like, "Oh, whoa, let's take a step back." But if someone's like, "Oh, we're all set," they say it with almost indifference. They're giving you slack to expand on your product and how it implements into their day to day. And so it's almost viewing tonality of like the temperature of their conversation, how they're feeling, and where you can actually take that.
That's what you said at the beginning when you are checking the temperature at the beginning of the call. So interesting. Now I want to focus on knowing that in September you are going to get 530% of quote attainment, which is huge. How do you keep pushing the boundaries and constantly improving in your cold calling game?
Typically, when the way I was starting to get like 2 to 300% every day was just with my why, right? And so sometimes when I forget that, and by the way, my why is my 7th month old. Like the biggest thing I fear is, not having enough money in the bank to, put my child on a field trip and then him being the only one who doesn't go, or not having enough money to pay for a surgery or something like that. And so I started being an SDR with like a certain amount of money in debt from not having a job prior. And then so I started it with my why of I need to provide for my family. But at the end of the day, when it's like 4 p.m. and APAC is awake, like your why will only take you so far once you hit a certain number. And so if you're hitting like 2 to 300% of quota, like you almost start becoming comfortable when it hits 4 p.m. And so if you are looking to squeeze the juice of like what you're actually capable of doing, like there's another SDR like at HG who I feel is can go toe to toe with me on every point of outbound, whether it's ping pong or hitting the phones, writing emails or talking to people on LinkedIn, is finding that 1 to 2 people who you feel actually motivate you or even getting in the office before you and going toe to toe with you. And then basically making little competitions with yourself to say, hey, I'm going to beat this person this month, or I'm going to try my best to beat this person this month. Worst case scenario, you walk away with a little bit more money in your pocket and you guys drive each other up. If you don't have that person at your company and you're somehow like the unicorn there, look at every past top performer who's ever been there. Listen and read all their Gong transcripts. Look at every single metric they've ever beaten and set a record for in terms of dials made, um, demos booked in a day, demos booked in a week, demos booked in a month, points in a month, commission made, and then write every single metric on a post-it note and then compete with that metric. And so that's what I would say, like when it comes past the point of why, just going the extra 5, 10 miles and pushing you past what you were previously capable of, like it's definitely the competitive nature of sales.
Will, you are telling me that you wanted to share something else about the imposter syndrome on call calls. So can you share an example of that?
No matter who it is on your STR team, I don't care if they hit 200, 300, 400, 500% of quota. Unless you're a unicorn, imposter syndrome hits you all the time. Like some days I go into work and I start cold calling and I'm like, what am I going to say? What am I going to say? Like, like last week I called a CRO, and I still ended up booking on the demo and like, curating towards the pain point. And he said, "Oh, this is actually really interesting. We're actually looking to evaluate a certain tool coming soon." And I hung up that call, and my whole body was just flustered with red, and I literally start shaking sometimes. So the only way I really get around that is just with volume. At the start of the day, If you are struggling with imposter syndrome and you feel like, oh, like maybe why is this guy doing so much better than me? Just call the CEO of every company before you start your day. Because any call after that, no matter if it's the CRO, a VP of sales, objectively speaking on the hierarchy, you just called their boss. And so if you can call their boss, you can call them. And so I'd say that's one of the biggest tips if you're struggling with imposter syndrome today.
And what do you think you are scared about this year specifically?
It's almost like I'm wasting $1,000 of his time, 'cause I don't know if you saw that on the meetings where people are like, "Oh, this meeting is worth $1,000."
Yeah, I saw
And
that.
I was
Yeah.
just like, "Oh, is this guy gonna get mad at me?" But then it's always reminding yourself, "Oh, if I'm thinking about that, I'm not having fun." And so you just gotta break that and understand, "Hey, this person is no better than me. This person is no worse than I am." At the end of the day, he has hair on his head, and he has hair under his arm, hair under his nose as well. There's nothing that differentiates them from me, and so there's no reason for me to actually be scared to talk to them.
And the other way also you can think about is for every conversation you have on the phone, you can bring them also revenue because your solution is really tied to revenue. So if you think about calling a CRO and you can bring them, I don't know what's the return of investment of AG, but I imagine it can be millions for specific companies. So is it for the time?
It is worth the
Yeah.
time, and
Yeah.
so no, I definitely agree with you there.
Well, we are almost at the end of the episode, but I have one last question for you. For an SDR, an account executive or a sales rep who is looking to improve their cold calling results, what will be your top one practical tip?
Laugh your way through everything, man. I think one of my colleagues at work has a saying that prospects will laugh their way onto a demo, and so just have fun. If you're having fun, they're having fun. It'll take you the extra mile no matter what.
Perfect. I think that's a beautiful way to end the episode, actually. Before we end the episode, do you have anything else you want to share with the audience?
I think I covered everything. I'm a pretty simple guy. Just stick to the fundamentals, get good at that, and then once you get good at the fundamentals, take it where life takes you.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. And for everyone listening, thank you. And I see you on the next episode.
Thank you, Alric.
If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. So for Spotify, to leave a review, what you can do is you can use your phone, then go on the Spotify app, then you go to the SDR game page, and then at the top of the page, you can leave a review. It's a 5-star review if you enjoyed the episode, obviously. And then if you are listening to this episode on Apple Podcasts, feel free also to leave a review on your app. Thanks for listening, and I see you on the next episode.